Hi, everyone. Welcome to Brownish Parenting with Dr. Amita on Ruckus Avenue Radio. This show unveils modern Desi parenting topics and explores the latest research for raising our bicultural children. Today, we're going to be unmasking why South Asian men have a difficult time being vulnerable and sharing their emotions. I would like to start by exploring how the South Asian culture can influence our ideas about emotions in general and then take a look at how that intersects with gender and masculinity. Today, we want to think about how we can have conversations that help us understand how culture and gender can play an important role in what we say, what we do, and how we feel. It's so hard for South Asian men to be able to talk about their emotions. There are so many cultural expectations related to how South Asian males need to be tough on the exterior by not showing their emotions, but also on the interior by not feeling their emotions and avoiding them completely. What this means is that being vulnerable by talking about your problems is often seen as a sign of weakness in our culture. This way of thinking has a lot to do with a boy's upbringing. When boys are being raised, their parents may have told them to suppress their emotions because they're boys. And so they've been told that that's what it means to be masculine. They may have heard things like, oh, boys don't cry. Stop crying right now. Or in America, you often hear about manning up. So basically, in both cultures, South Asian and American, we're saying the same thing, that there's one way to be a man, and that's not to display your emotions or your feelings. This type of discourse makes it really difficult for South Asian men to be human and to feel and to express the range of feelings to the people who are the closest to them. And that means their parents, they have a hard time telling their parents how they're feeling, their close friends, or their intimate partners. South Asian men also didn't have role models who shared their emotions with them. Most South Asian dads are either stoic or they show anger, but there isn't this range of emotions in between that they can really show. So South Asian men struggle to learn healthy ways to identify their emotions and then to regulate those emotions and express them to others. When they do want to share, they may fear that being vulnerable may lead them to being rejected by their community or judged by their community, especially in a culture where there's a lot of pressure to conform. The South Asian men in my family and in my extended family, they have difficulty with interpersonal relationships because they lack that emotional connection and know how to really foster that connection with others. Lewis Howes wrote a book called The Masks of Masculinity, and that looks at these various masks that men put on to hide their true emotions, such as being stoic, being athletic, being aggressive, being like a joker, always, making fun of things, feeling like you're invincible, like nothing bad can happen to them, being a know-it-all and knowing everything and not needing help from others, or being alpha, like being that dominant leader. And I think about that tragic case of Robin Williams, who got people to laugh and to feel joy in their lives, but he was battling his own darker emotions inside. The discourses that boys are growing up with lead them to constantly and continuously avoid their emotions. Unfortunately, this has many negative repercussions later on in life that can manifest in physical and psychological health problems. The stats reveal that South Asian men are lonely, and the men that feel it the most are unmarried men. Live Mit also looks at the pressure to adhere to stereotypes in distancing men from their friends and family. 11 out of 15 men that were spoken to in this article admitted that they would rather sit at home and watch movies or play video games alone than talk about what was going on inside of them in terms of feelings or emotions. And in many Asian American cultures, parents may tell their children to control or suppress those emotions because expressing those emotions and feelings are at odds with the cultural goals of social harmony. But let's think about what happens to our boys if we don't address emotions for them. I wrote an article for Brown Girl magazine that explored why parents need to help children identify and regulate emotions, especially when things don't go their way. I want parents to be aware of how emotions can really manifest with internalizing behavior, where they direct that behavior inside of them, and that oftentimes leads to anxiety or depression, or externalizing behavior. And this is where they direct that behavior outside of them, such as tragic incidents like school shootings. One stat that I pointed out to was related to mass school shooters who are typically men. The school shooters often have a history of being rejected socially, emotionally, or romantically. They may have been bullied or targeted in some way, and they're typically angry young men who harbor resentment and hatred. They're also socially isolated from others, and they have this need to prove themselves to others. And what adds to this inner emotional turmoil is that they have not been taught how to deal with difficult, negative, and uncomfortable emotions. And they need to learn healthy ways of coping. Today, I want to empower parents with these tools that they need to create this safe space for their children to be able to even know what emotions they're feeling, but then to know what they need to do with them after they feel those emotions and how they can express those emotions to others so that their parents can help them. Let's pause for a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk to our guest, Ankur Varma, the founder of Brown Man Therapy, about how we can do this. Welcome back. Today we have Ankur Varma here, the founder of Brown Man Therapy, to help guide us through our conversations about boys, masculinity, and emotions. Ankur Varma is a licensed psychotherapist with 10 plus years of leadership experience in community mental health and education to advocate for accessibility and culturally informed therapy in Chicago and Greater Illinois. Ankur is passionate about bringing a multicultural, person-centered approach to reach people who have been previously marginalized or carry stigma around their own wellness. He started Brown Man Therapy with the mission to engage more men and normalize conversations about mental health in South Asian cultures. More recently, Ankur joined the leadership team of South Asian Solidarity Movement, an organization working to build a community of anti-racist and justice-oriented South Asian Americans that promotes inclusion, equity, and cross-racial solidarity within the city of Chicago and beyond. I want to thank Ankur for being here today to help guide us through some of these conversations about boys and their emotions. But before we do that, Ankur, I'd love to just get an understanding of your own upbringing and what got you into this field. As founder of Brown Man Therapy, I can tell you that when I was telling people about my guests on this show, everyone's reaction was kind of like, oh, interesting, Brown Man Therapy. And they were very fascinated and wanted to know more about your journey.
Yeah, thanks, Amita, for having
Mhm.
me. And I'm excited to have this conversation. For me, the brown man therapy part of things, those two have been kind of married over the last several years of my career. And the first, I've been doing therapeutic work for maybe 10 to 12 years now. And the first half of my career was largely with other communities and other populations outside of the South Asian community. And only in the last 5 or so years have I really started to see kind of more kind of steam picking up
Yeah.
in terms of the South Asian community being interested in mental health,
Mhm.
interested in therapy, and and so I kind of jumped in more recently in the last couple of years, also coming from it from a personal perspective, and that was the first time in my career that I've really been able to marry my personal experiences, my personal upbringing with the professional work that I do. So for my upbringing, I come from a, maybe what is a typical story in terms of, my family moved here to the States from India in the 70s. So my family's been here for quite a while.
Mhm.
And I was born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Mhm.
And my family is mostly Punjabi. And we have a big family, a
Yeah.
very close family. And so, a lot of cultural traditions, a
Mhm.
lot of family traditions, a lot of, kind of collective thinking in terms of doing things for our family and being close to our family. And so, that was an experience. So for me, that was very different from the people that I grew up around who were not South Asian and
Yeah.
who didn't come from a similar cultural background. And so for me, I really had this foundation in my own
Mhm.
identity building of like, who am I at school versus who am I at home, or who am I at work versus home, and so
Yeah.
on. And what I've realized now in the latter part of my career is
Mhm.
that there are so many of us who have had similar
Yes.
experiences and have had to feel like, okay, I'm going to put this mask on for this,
Mhm.
situation and take it off for this one. And, kind of it's almost like a double-edged sword in the sense that,
Yeah.
it creates a lot of good strengths and traits in us to be able to identify across different cultural groups or different types of communities. But at the
Yeah.
same time, sometimes we lose a little track of, who am I
Who?
and who are
Yeah.
we? And so that's very much been a part of my own journey, as well as, now the people that I work with in therapy.
Yeah, I definitely can relate to being that chameleon and trying to figure out how I fit into different groups and different settings. And were there life experiences that led you to realizing that you wanted to prioritize your emotions?
I think, you know, and this is really similar, I
Hmm.
think, for a lot of people, is I kind of had to, I was forced to. I
Okay.
hit some
Hmm.
speed bumps and some hardships
Hmm.
that I didn't expect. And so, part of having to deal with a significant change in your life
Yeah.
or failure, even, is that you have to confront your emotions. You have to confront the hardship. Otherwise, it will kind of eat you up. And so, unfortunately, there's a lot of us who don't deal with things until we absolutely have to, where we've kind of hit
Yeah.
that quote unquote rock bottom. And, I don't know that I was at my rock bottom, but I was
Hmm.
probably, somewhere down there.
Hmm.
And I think it kind of forced me to have to open up with my parents or open up with my family, ask other people for help, which is something that to this day I'm still not very good at, but is really important. And, I think there's probably several moments where I had to,
Yeah.
kind of make myself vulnerable and
Hmm.
recognize, hey, I can't do this on my own. I need to ask for help. I need to reach out to my parents. I need to
Yeah.
kind of put my pride aside and let people in a way that, I never thought I was
Yeah.
supposed to, right? I'm supposed to be able to handle stuff. I'm an adult. I'm supposed to be able to manage
Yeah.
my finances and my career and my education all on my own, which is kind of silly now thinking about it because we
Hmm.
can never really do anything on our own.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That's such a great point because there's so many. As you were talking, I was just thinking about the South Asian males in my life, extended family, friends, and all of them had to hit that point where
Mm.
they were like, now I have to tell someone, I have to do something. And it was maybe initial conversations with me, but I was like, hey, you got to tell your parents. You got to open up. I'm sure that's a theme that you probably see with your clients as well that come to you. Um,
Yeah, and sorry, I was
yeah.
just going to add, like,
Yeah.
and it's interesting to see sometimes people are, right at that end point
Hmm.
where now it's like, I'm finally trying this because I don't know where else to go.
Yeah.
But I am also, it's cool to see people are saying, hey, I want to get out ahead of this, and that's really the idea, is getting out
Yeah.
ahead um, of the issue so that you don't feel kind of backed into the corner.
Yeah, yeah. And when you got into this profession, were there other professions you considered before becoming a licensed psychotherapist, or what led you to pursuing this profession that not a lot of brown men pursue? Yeah.
Yeah, I actually, initially I went into pre-med and medicine
Hmm.
was kind of my focus, which is a more typical South Asian career field to go into. And when I realized that, medicine was not the route for me, and then I really struggled with that route. I had to, it was one of those, I have to pivot
Yeah.
now. I'm at that point where I need to ask for help and I need to revisit kind of some of my
Hmm.
visions for the future. And so, what happened is that, I had to actually work some odd jobs while I was figuring out what do I want to do next. And, one of those odd jobs was in sales. And
Hmm.
so I knew that was never, the future for
Yeah.
me, but it actually helped me get out of my comfort zone
Yeah.
and help me grow, in
Hmm.
terms of socially and in terms of working with other people, getting to know other people, connecting with other people. And then that's when I started to realize that I wanted to go into mental health. Even in my like medical studies, I realized that all the psychology classes and
Hmm.
behavioral health classes were the ones that I was really interested in, and always walked away with some sort of amazement. And I finally had like a couple of friends who were like, I think you need to
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
this work instead of trying to kind of force the issue in that more
Hmm.
typical direction of medicine. And so, was life was like, hey, you need to pick something else. And
Yeah.
then I was able to, again, use my community, use my family and friends to help kind of guide me into a direction where I felt like I can best use my abilities.
Yeah, that's great. I'm so glad you had that support too, because I know that's a challenging route to take when you probably didn't
Yeah.
have very many models that were pursuing a route as a psychotherapist. And, I talked to my son about that today. He's 16 and, we were talking about career paths and he was saying how mom, wow, dad went the medicine route. He's not in medicine, my husband.
Mm.
His uncle, my brother went the medicine route. Again, did not become a doctor. But I was like, yeah, this is why I want you to really think through what you want to do and what classes you enjoy and what you like, because pretty much everyone in our generation, like that was a path that they took and they didn't really think about it. They just kind of followed along with what their parents were telling them to do and some of those pressures and expectations that were placed on them. So we're gonna take a break, and when we come back, we're gonna talk a little bit more about that, what South Asian men go through and the boxes that they're put in. Welcome back. You're listening to Brownish Parenting with Dr. Amita on Ruckus Avenue Radio. We're now going to talk to Ankur a little bit more about stereotypes for South Asian men and masculinity and where they came from and what they are.
Yeah. So, I think what I was talking about with
Mhm.
going into medicine, and I think we can probably all relate to the experience of having a few careers to choose from.
Yeah.
And really, when I think about those careers, it's yeah, they're maybe they're science based, or maybe they're really important, right? Being a physician is a really important degree and job to
Yeah.
have. But at the end of the day, too, I think, there's an important immigrant aspect to consider here. And a
Hmm.
couple of things that I think about, which is, we need stability, right? When you move all the way across the world to a country that speaks a different language or practices or certain traditions differently and,
Yeah.
so completely foreign, the first thing you want to do is stabilize.
Yeah.
Naturally, that's kind of our biology is to try to stabilize
Hmm.
in the face of change. And so, finding those career paths to financial stability, to, safety are really
Yeah.
important for many immigrants. And, one of the ways that I've seen this play out in South Asians is that, we try to fit in
Yeah.
and we try to acculturate and assimilate
Mhm.
into the Western or American culture so that, we are less at conflict, less at friction
Yeah.
with the society around us. And so that's a great approach. I'm
Hmm.
not going to judge and say that's an unhealthy or healthy approach
Yeah.
because I didn't immigrate myself here. So I have to have respect for,
Yeah.
my parents, my grandparents who
Yeah.
made that difficult decision and journey across. And, I think it's also important for us to recognize that it's okay for us to want to fit in. Um,
Yeah.
at the same time, when we try to fit in, we also, naturally part of that process is us giving up some things that are also
Hmm.
important to our identity. And when we think about culture and we think about mixing culture, I think that's, a big part of this, right? Is that
Yeah.
if I want to play that role of, hey, I fit into this American culture and American
Hmm.
society and I'm playing my role, then what happened to my roots? And
Yeah.
so sometimes that kind of back and forth can create
Hmm.
some distress, some friction, and especially when we're, going through, different identity changes, whether that's, getting married or becoming parents. And, then it's like, well, what do I teach my kids, right? How do I
Yeah.
show them the way forward
Hmm.
into this, kind of bicultural, multicultural world?
And I think about that just sort of fitting in because you're also denying your own emotions in that process. You're kind of trying to stay silent and be these good model minority immigrants that are doing what they're expected to do in our society, which is pursue that professional track, right? And that's why we were invited in the 1960s, like that post 1965
Hmm.
immigration law. And then the parents are like, hey, we got to continue doing this. We got to continue being these good minorities that pursue these professions. And so that kind of gets translated down when we think about our culture to like South Asian men, because they're the ones that have to pursue the profession, the professional route, and make the money and all of that, right? What do you see as, even with your clients that you're working with, what are they struggling with when you think about some of those expectations that are placed on them, South Asian brown men?
There's this socialization that there are certain things that make you weaker. And as
Hmm.
men, strength is probably the number one trait that we need to demonstrate out to the world, right?
Yeah.
I'm not weak. You can't hurt me. Your words can't hurt me. Your fists can't hurt me. And so that's the kind of the message that I have to show to the world. And it's really difficult because even now, there are moments where if I'm feeling very highly emotional
Hmm.
and I have to, if I'm talking to my wife or talking to a friend and I have to share that, it's really difficult. My first instinct is to swallow it and keep
Yeah.
it inside. And, you asked about the socialization, and this is something that happens, it's all of our responsibility to kind of
Hmm.
change the narrative here
Yeah.
because men socialize boys in this way and women socialize boys in this way where
Yeah.
we tell young boys that there are only these two or three emotions that you're allowed to express,
Yeah.
or these other behaviors,
Yeah.
especially crying, that
Hmm.
you're only allowed to cry at a funeral, or
Yeah.
if your pet
Hmm.
dies, but you're not allowed to cry if you had a really hard day at school or work.
Yeah.
And I have never talked to somebody who's like, oh, I felt heavier after a good cry,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so, it's something that starts at a very young age. And, it happens in those small comments, in those small decisions that we make
Yes.
that don't really, when we look at them from, a kind of zoomed out perspective, or sometimes I like to
Hmm.
think about it as like, what if an alien landed on Earth
Yeah.
and asked you about this custom or this decision that you made
Hmm.
or this label that you used? How would you explain why you used it? And can
Yeah.
you justify that? Right.
Hmm.
And so it's like when we do gender reveals, we pick blue for boys and pink
Yeah.
for girls. And now it's like it's completely, acceptable, or
Hmm.
more acceptable now to as a guy wear pink or purple. Whereas like
Hmm.
as a kid, or in the 90s, you would have gotten beaten up or really made fun of for doing that. And
Yeah.
now it's kind of the cool thing. I remember when Kanye
Yeah.
West wore a pink polo, and it was like all the all the news
Yeah.
was about that. And so
Yeah.
I think it's sometimes it's so like if an alien landed next to me and said,
Yeah.
oh, why won't you let your son wear a pink shirt?
Yeah.
How would you possibly justify that, right? How would
Yes.
you possibly explain that? And so sometimes it's about just recognizing those
Hmm.
small ways in which we tell kids that, hey, this is a boy thing and this is a girl thing, when there really isn't any like biological or evolutionary reason for
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. This reminds me of when my son's teacher, Mr. Fogel, dressed up as a pink crayon for Halloween. And all the boys, though, were like, you can't be a pink crayon. And he was like, why not? Why can't I be a pink crayon? And
Hmm.
so, having teachers, parents kind of disrupt the discourse that maybe they've heard, or change that discourse, like you're saying, to understand that you can be and do all of these things, is going to be really, really important, especially for dads, to showcase their emotions to their sons and to their daughters, and just be that model. To I always say, just like, speak out loud what you're thinking, and tell your
Hmm.
children, like, hey, I was frustrated today, this happened to me, and model that, right? Like, be able to say that to them so they can see that, hey, my dad does have lots of different emotions that he feels throughout the day, because most likely they did not have dads that were able to model that for them. So it is a little bit unnatural, like you're saying, like, to be able to do that, but to I don't know if there's a way to tune into that, because I know you were also saying that when you feel emotions, sometimes you were trying not to share them. Is there a way that you kind of were able to change that for yourself?
Well, I had the benefit of going to grad school
Yeah.
and getting a degree
Yeah.
that, teaches me
Yeah.
to, identify emotions,
Uh-huh.
really understand what emotional control is. And I want to, come back to that term.
Uh-huh.
Where I start though is with um, recognizing that emotions are not gendered, right?
Yeah.
We all experience emotions. And in
Yeah.
fact, if we want to have better communication, connection, relationships
Hmm.
with other people,
Yeah.
we need to have a better understanding of our emotions. you can speak any language, you can have any level of ability, you can be any gender, you can be any race, you can be
Hmm.
any religion, so on and so forth. And you can have all these differences, but the one thing that connects us is our ability to feel.
Yeah.
And so, when we don't have that emotional bandwidth or
Hmm.
that emotional capacity, meaning we don't have that range of emotions, or we can't name that range of emotions that we experience, then it makes us really struggle with the connection piece to other
Yeah.
folks. And so where I start with this is I use a tool called the feelings wheel,
Hmm.
with a lot of people. And I actually, earlier in my career, I worked a lot more with children and adolescents. And that's
Yeah.
where I started using this. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a colorful wheel of emotions,
Yeah.
and it's organized by different,
Uh-huh.
kind of core emotions. And then as you get to the outside of the wheel, there's more specific, secondary, tertiary emotions. And I will start there with adults. And
Yeah.
what I realized is I worked on it with kids, and then I started
Mhm.
working on it on naming emotions using the feelings wheel with
Yeah.
adults. And I
Yeah.
had such a great reaction where people were like, actually, and they like, I can see
Yeah.
them turning the wheel and turning their head. And actually, I felt this and this and this. And we started the conversation by saying, that made me feel really angry,
Yeah.
to that brought up a lot of hurt, disappointment. I felt let down. I
Yeah.
felt a little guilty. And all of a sudden, it's not anger, it's four emotions. And all
Yeah.
of a sudden, we're seeing, oh, this actually, my guilt comes from this thing. And my anger comes
Mhm.
from this, and my disappointment comes from this, or this is why I felt this way. And all of a sudden, now we're having a conversation rather than, okay, I feel angry, I'm going to go punch the pillow or the wall, or
Yeah.
I'm going to have a drink, or I'm going to go, to the gun range, whatever
Hmm.
your release is,
Yes.
oh, I can actually come back and talk to my partner about this, or talk to my friend about this, or talk to my parent or my child, right? So now we're all of a sudden we're having a conversation rather than
Hmm.
we shut down or we react in typically unhealthy ways.
Yeah, that is such a good point. Because I remember I watched this episode on Mel Robbins where they were talking about this feelings wheel and they were talking about somebody who had road rage and was just getting really, really angry in the car. But then they realized that that was the typical, anytime they felt an emotion because they didn't know how to connect with it, it was always this rage that showed up. And until they were exposed to that feelings wheel and they were able to pinpoint what it was, and it was a lesser degree to, it was something more complex and nuanced, like you're saying, like it was the guilt or the shame or feeling isolated or lonely. But because they weren't asked to reflect on it, it just showed up as this anger and
Mm-hmm.
rage. Yeah. So that is such a great point to have that. I actually have a free feelings wheel that I can link in the episode later on through my social edge. So we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we will talk a little bit more about raising our children and understanding this idea of toxic masculinity. Welcome back. You're listening to Brownish Parenting with Dr. Amita on Ruckus Avenue Radio. We're now going to talk a little bit more about this idea of toxic masculinity and what it means and why it can be harmful for men. So, Ankur, if you can just walk us through a little bit of what that terminology looks like and sounds like and what it means. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, by just a definition standpoint, toxic masculinity is, any belief that we have kind of socialized under this term masculine, male related, men related, that we no longer really serves us a purpose.
Yeah.
And what that might mean is that it is, causes oppressive behaviors of
Hmm.
maybe other genders or other people. It could cause some sort of, phobia. Again, goes along with
Yeah.
that in terms of like we think about things like homophobia within the like cis hetero male
Hmm.
community. And then, other things that, like I said earlier, don't serve us. So that might even be things like, oh, boys will be boys, or boys don't cry,
Yeah.
or be a man. I remember from, earlier in our lives, we had this whole like beer commercial that was a whole marketing thing around
Yeah.
earning your man card and keeping your man card. And,
Wow.
and each commercial was like a different behavior that
Hmm.
real men don't do. And so that to me is, kind of what builds into toxic masculinity in that, we've defined it as masculine and it really doesn't serve us because it really, maybe shuts off a part of ourselves or makes us feel that, there's something invalid about something I'm experiencing, thinking, or feeling. And so it's a really fluid kind of definition
Yeah.
because I think it's changed over time.
Yeah.
And so it's also important to remember that these things once served a purpose, whether they
Hmm.
were, harmful or not, they served a purpose at times. And so it's also important to approach this topic with a little bit of, patience
Yeah.
when we're talking about it, because I think it's very, it brings up a lot of emotions for people when we talk about masculinity and toxic masculinity.
Yeah, because there's men that, associate, they enjoy being masculine, and you have to think about how when you think about toxic, you're thinking about the ways in which it's harmful or self-destructive, like you were saying as well. So there is this notion of what is masculine and then what is toxic masculinity. And I've heard of just, men that just don't want to go to see the doctor when they're dealing with something. And that's very, very
Mm-hmm.
harmful, right? Like where you're just like, I don't need a doctor. I'm good. I'm okay. So thinking through that, but then also like you're saying, like the cultural aspects, like in rural cultures, there's like the gun culture, or like there's like, in suburban cultures, like man
Mm-hmm.
caves and things like that. So thinking through when does it become toxic and it keeps you again from living a well-balanced, happy life, right? Healthy life, really. So I want to talk a little bit about just how the socialization process happens for boys growing up and things that may lead them down this path of maybe this toxic masculinity where you feel like you can't show your emotions and what sometimes parents may say, like you kind of talked about like manning up and things like that. But I know when I'm at like a toy store sometimes, I'll hear parents say, "No, you can't get that doll." And it is harder for boys to play with dolls than it is for girls to play with trucks. So based on the stereotypes that exist, where men are more bound to the stereotypes for masculinity because of the
Mm-hmm.
power and the privilege, right, that's there. So, are there other things that you feel like that you see from a young age that maybe you want to call attention to for parents?
Yeah, well, just on a quick lighter note,
Yeah,
I grew up playing with dolls
yeah,
that were dressed in costumes and capes. They were called
okay,
Batman and
yeah,
Spider-Man and Wolverine, and Wolverine wears tights. So
yeah,
I think just even if you like,
yeah,
we don't have to make this such a serious
yeah,
conversation. It's just let's just talk about this realistically,
yeah,
right? We all play with dolls, whether they were GI soldiers or Barbie, and
uh-huh,
and I think the idea here is that, somehow there's this socialization that there are certain things that make you weaker. And as
hmm,
men, strength is probably the number one trait that we need to demonstrate out to the world, right?
yeah,
I'm not weak. You can't hurt me. Your words can't hurt me. Your fists can't hurt me. And so that's the kind of the message that I have to show to the world. And it's really difficult because even now, there are moments where if I'm feeling very highly emotional
hmm,
and I have to, if I'm talking to my wife or talking to a friend and I have to share that, it's really difficult. My first instinct is to swallow it and keep
yeah,
it inside. And, you asked about the socialization, and this is something that happens, it's all of our responsibility to kind of change
hmm,
the narrative here,
yeah,
because men socialize boys in this way and women socialize boys in this way, where
yeah,
we tell young boys that there are only these two or three emotions that you're allowed to express,
yeah,
or these other behaviors,
yeah,
especially crying, that
hmm,
you're only allowed to cry at a funeral, or
yeah,
if your pet
hmm,
dies, but you're not allowed to cry if you had a really hard day at school or work.
yeah,
And I have never talked to somebody who's like, oh, I felt heavier after a good cry,
yeah,
right? And
yeah,
so it's something that starts at a very young age, and it happens in those small comments, in those small decisions that we make
yes,
that don't really, when we look at them from, a kind of zoomed out perspective, or sometimes I like to
Hmm.
think about it as like, what if an alien landed on Earth
Yeah.
and asked you about this custom or this decision that you made
Hmm.
or this label that you used? How would you explain why you used it? And can
Yeah.
you justify that? Right.
Hmm.
And so it's like when we do gender reveals, we pick blue for boys and pink
Yeah.
for girls. And now it's like it's completely, acceptable or more
Hmm.
acceptable now to as a guy wear pink or purple, whereas like
Hmm.
as a kid or in the 90s you would have gotten beaten up or really made fun of for doing that. And
Yeah.
now it's kind of the cool thing. I remember when Kanye
Yeah.
West wore a pink polo, and it was like all the all the news
Yeah.
was about that. And so
Yeah.
I think it's sometimes it's so like if an alien landed next to me and said,
Yeah.
"Oh, why won't you let your son wear a pink shirt?"
Yeah.
How would you possibly justify that, right? How would
Yes.
you possibly explain that? And so sometimes it's about just recognizing those
Hmm.
small ways in which we, tell kids that, hey, this is a boy thing and this is a girl thing, when there really isn't any like biological or evolutionary reason.
And we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about understanding how things are changing in the field. I'm wondering for South Asian brown men, what maybe some of those first steps could be if they're not ready to go to therapy, but they want to start to do some of that self-reflection that we've talked about.
Yeah, that's a great question because, no therapist wants you to feel forced to be in
Yeah.
therapy. It's a process that you should feel somewhat ready for. It doesn't
Yeah.
mean that you have to have the answers in terms of what you absolutely need or what your exact goals are. And so maybe it's just a little bit of self-reflection in terms of where am I now in terms of my life and the family, social, career, and other, aspects. Biological, your physical health is
Yeah.
really important here to consider, and see if there are areas that you feel the need to or desire to
Mhm.
improve. And I feel like sometimes we think, and this goes back to the masculinity, kind of the more typical masculinity definition is like, oh, we should know the answers and
Yeah.
or know how to
Yeah.
get the answers.
Hmm.
And so I think vulnerability, if we think about vulnerability as strength, then that means asking for help. And I mentioned earlier, like it's still a struggle sometimes for me to ask for help.
Hmm.
And a lot of times too, a good place to start is, the feelings wheel is a very accessible tool. And so sometimes it's about allowing yourself to educate on certain topics. And,
Yeah.
we have the internet, we have so much
Hmm.
information out there. There are people out there that are providing this information, and most of us in this field will happily provide this information, for free because it's really important. And so do some reading, Googling, it's a
Yeah.
great place to start. Sometimes it sounds too simple to start with
Yeah.
Google, but
Yeah.
there are other people who are experiencing the things that you're experiencing. And if you're not yet comfortable reaching out to your own community, your
Hmm.
family and friends, then reach out to the online community. And what I've found too is sometimes even asking one or two friends or family members, have you done therapy or what's your experience been like, has been really, eye-opening, where, once you start the conversation and
Yeah.
open that gate, then you start to realize, hey, actually there are people in my life that have gone to therapy, and it's not as, you know, quote
Yeah.
unquote bad as I thought or scary. And there is a natural anxiety to processes like these because, I think you mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
right? Our parents and our grandparents didn't do stuff like this. They didn't
Yeah.
have the
Yeah.
privilege of self-reflection, right? Maybe they
Yeah.
were working three jobs and, just focused on their
Hmm.
kids. And so they sacrificed their own emotional and mental health for, kind of the good of the family. And hopefully you have that ability to step back and ask for help. And it's more accessible now. Most insurances cover mental health care. All insurances, at least in the US, should.
Yeah.
And so there are resources out there, and I will guess that almost every therapist is willing to offer a
Hmm.
free phone or Zoom consultation
That's
to
great.
answer your questions. And so I'm always at the end of every first session, I always ask,
Yeah.
do you want to continue? This is not a forced process. This is not a mandatory thing. And the last thing I want to say is about, this idea of emotional control and
Uh-huh.
just recognizing that as you go through this
Hmm.
identification, growth process, you start to learn that there are different ways to channel your energy. And if you are a
Yeah.
parent, that is a really good way to also model for your kids is that, hey, I'm
Yeah.
able to name more emotions. Hey, dad is feeling really, upset today because of this. And I
Yeah.
just need, some space to myself, or I just want to play a game or something like that. And it's okay to do that. And, like you said, that takes a certain
Yeah.
level of strength to be able to say that. So
Yes.
if you're worried about,
Yeah.
okay, I'm doing emotional work and that's making me feel weak, or that's a weak process, it's actually the exact opposite. It is a
Hmm.
strength process. It comes from a place of strength to make ourselves emotionally vulnerable.
We're going to take a break. And when we come back, we'll just talk a little bit more about any other themes you're seeing out in the field when it comes to South Asian brown men.
Yeah, I think we were just talking about what can men do, especially if they're not maybe feeling ready for therapy. And one common theme that I've noticed is a lack of social community,
Hmm.
or strong social relationships. So you might be a very outgoing person with a lot
Yeah.
of friends, and see the other dads or other
Yeah.
guys on the weekend, and go watch playoffs or whatever, right?
Hmm.
But there's a general, I think, lacking of depth to our
Yeah.
social relationships the older we get. And in our younger years, maybe in college or early in our work lives, we build a lot of those relationships based off of just interests, and but we don't really share too much of
Yeah.
the deeper stuff. And so later on, maybe into our 30s and 40s, what we start to notice then is that we have friends, but we've never talked about hard stuff. And now all of a sudden, I'm a parent, or I'm going through some
Hmm.
financial struggle or some other
Yeah.
distressor, or, my parents are getting older and I'm struggling with that aspect of things. And I have nobody to talk to about it, right? I can talk
Hmm.
to maybe my wife, or, another sibling or something like that, but maybe not a,
Yeah.
friend. And
Hmm.
so a lot of South Asian men have kind of struggled to maintain, healthy, strong, deep
Yeah.
relationships with their friends. And so, that's one thing that I encourage you to do at any age is, um, either revisit these topics with
Hmm.
friends, and
Yeah.
just, set it up as, hey, I want to talk about some hard stuff. I know we
Yeah.
never talk about that, but
Yeah.
hey, can we? Maybe you
Hmm.
pick one person and you just go out with them and grab a bite to eat, and you talk about it together, because I can almost guarantee that that person also wants to
Yeah.
have a deeper connection, right? If you are friends, then that means that you should be able to have those connections, and maybe you've never done it, so it's a good place to start together. And the other thing I'll add to that is sometimes people feel like, okay, I've been so focused on family and work
Hmm.
and all of this that I haven't maintained any friendships, or not a significant amount of friendship. And so maybe there are people who are trying to make new friends,
Yeah.
in their 30s or 40s. And
Yeah.
so my recommendation there is, also a therapeutic one, which is to revisit activities, interests, hobbies that you
Mm,
had when you
yeah.
were
Yeah.
a kid or when you
Hmm.
were younger, whether it's sports or whether it's, something new that you are willing to
Yeah.
try, and build community in that way. Because there are people out there, especially now that we're in such an online world. We're having this conversation
Yeah.
from halfway across the country. And so much of our lives live on Zoom, or live,
Yeah.
in our phones. And
Hmm.
so, that face to face, person to person connection is
Yeah.
becoming rare. And
Hmm.
that in and of itself is very therapeutic. And so whatever way you can find, whether,
Yeah.
I had just a male client tell me that he started a pottery class and he's loving it, and
Uh,
he's not something that he ever thought he
yeah.
would do. And he's made a couple friends. And so, sometimes it's about,
What a
again,
wonderful example. Yeah.
pushing
Yeah.
yourself out of your
Yeah.
comfort zone. And
Uh-huh.
really what I notice is it's not just being out of your comfort zone, but once you do that, then your comfort zone expands. And
Yeah.
so you don't feel that anxiety, or that fear every time, but maybe the first time or two. And then once you start getting the ball rolling, it becomes much easier to, make friends or have those hard, vulnerable
Yeah.
conversations.
Yeah. My husband has definitely been an advocate for having these tough conversations now after we've had so many conversations about how important it is. And I will tell you that the minute he starts talking about something that's tough or being vulnerable, it's amazing how receptive, like again, his friends are. They are calling him. They're like, "Hey, do you have a minute to talk? I just had to run something by you." And it's like those deeper, meaningful conversations like we're talking about.
Mm.
And once that ball gets rolling, right, it just takes one person, one male out there. Because a lot of times, again, it's usually the females that are having these conversations. And, being in an intimate, healthy relationship, like that's a protective factor for males, but they don't have, like you were saying, a group of guys that can really talk about these tough topics with. Great just to hear about this for parents who want to raise their sons to also have these deep, meaningful relationships. And it starts with, again, that first relationship with the parents, with the dad, with the mom, and then they're able to then have those tough conversations with their peer group. And so this podcast is all about helping our children grow up to be, the best versions of themselves, like living up to their fullest potential. And the best way to do that, again, is to have these conversations, get to know your children, get to know the emotions they're feeling, use that feelings wheel that we talked about. So I really want to thank you, Ankur. We have learned so much from our conversation here today. And before we leave, I just want to make sure guests can still reach out to you and figure out like how can they find you? Where can they find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram at Brown Man Therapy. Please feel free to message me directly if you have questions about therapy, if you have, any sorts of thoughts that you want to share about your own experience. I'm always happy to connect with people. And even if you need some guidance in terms of finding a therapist, I might not be able to work with you myself or direct you specifically to a therapist, but I'm always happy to give you some guidance if I can in that realm. And really the last message that I want to kind of put out there is, especially for those of us who have come from recent immigrant families and
Yeah.
experiences, we are learning to do things in brand new ways. Our parents didn't have models in front of them in terms of immigrating to this country or our
Yeah.
grandparents or whoever it was.
Yeah.
And the same way, we don't have those same models for people in our generational space. And the same way that our kids don't have that exact same model for things like social media and technology. And so this is a collaborative process that we're in, and it is okay to fail. It is okay to
Yeah.
struggle. And in fact, I will tell you in my own life, I have learned the most from my struggles and failures and not
Mm-hmm.
from my biggest successes. And so, as quickly and as much as you're able to kind of reframe that,
Yeah.
I think the better things will go.
Yeah. And I love how you stated that making the mistakes, repairing, but also reframing and coming back from that. Because I know as South Asians, a lot of times we're really hard on ourselves. So to practice that, right? Self-compassion is key. And that's something that we also have to cultivate in ourselves to grow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Imagine if we put the same pressure on self-awareness and cultivation and emotional intelligence that we do on math grades.
Yeah.
What if we approach the things that way? So,
I love
yeah.
that. Yep. That's what I'm working on here. All right. So next week we're going to be talking to Ekta Agarwal, a licensed clinical social worker and the CEO and psychotherapist of Shakti Therapy and Healing Center, more about parenting and attachment styles. Stay tuned.